I companioned a tomcat named Spot for 15 years. I don't say I had a cat named Spot. Nobody ever has a cat. Spot was one of the 10 cats and a beagle who lived with my college roommate and his wife. And with a baby in their home, they were trying to give away some of the cats. Spot was different, I was told. Out of those 10 cats, he was the only one who befriended the dog. When the cats and dog were put into the basement for the night, Spot and the beagle would play a game they created. Later, Spot would befriend a cat at the kiddie spa that I left him at in New Hampshire when I traveled. He also befriended other dogs and liked to play with them too. Spot was born that way. He was not like any other cat I have known, and most cats were often confused by his behavior. When I was younger, I believed that human beings began as blank slates and were formed by their experiences. Spot changed that perception. His experiences could not account for his behavior. They could not have been much radically different from the other cats in the basement. His friendliness was an innate quality to his personality. He was just born that way. Human beings are not cats, but we may be born with innate personality qualities that are tempered by personal experiences. February is Black History Month, and the person I want to talk about was like that. Her name was Ida B. Wells, and she was an extraordinary human being. She was unlike anyone alive during her lifetime, and some of this uniqueness can only be attributed to her innate personality. Ida B. Wells is best known today for publicizing the lynching of African Americans and organizing opposition to lynching. Though she was powerfully involved in that, Ida B. Wells was also involved in women's suffrage, women's rights, African American civil rights, organizing Black women socially and preventing official segregation in the Chicago public schools. She was internationally renowned for her efforts. Ida B. Wells was born a slave in Mississippi in 1862 and was freed as an infant in 1865 by the Emancipation Proclamation. As a free man, James Wells, her father, founded a carpentry business and became a trustee of what is now Rust College. Education was important to their family. Both of her parents died when Wells was 16 years old, and she was passed from family member to family member. She found work teaching and was able to support her younger siblings. Eventually, she moved to Memphis, Tennessee with her siblings for extra support from her aunt. During her summer breaks, she attended sessions at Fisk University and Lemoyne Owen College. Both are still African American institutions of higher education. In 1883, she got into some good trouble when she was ordered by a conductor to leave the seat in first class for which she had paid on the train because she was Black. The conductor and two men dragged her off the train. She gained publicity when she wrote about the incident in a Memphis Black church publication. She sued the train company over the incident and won, but her case was overturned on appeal by the train company to the Tennessee Supreme Court. Shortly after, Wells started writing about oppressive laws in a Black church newspaper. This led her to starting up her own newspaper, Free Speech and Headlight, and she also became its editor. She was fired by the school board shortly after because she wrote articles criticizing conditions in Black schools. That's to be expected. If you're a teacher, you can't really publicly criticize the Board of Education. There was a small race riot in Memphis, and a white mob took a grocery store owner out of town and murdered him with some other men. The grocer was a close friend of Ida B. Wells. She stood as godmother to one of his children. While this incident was tragic, it caused her to consider lynching in a larger context. Her friend was not an isolated victim, but one of many victims of violent racism. Out of her grief, she made it her life's work to shine a light on what was happening. Lynching was what she became known for. However, it was only one of the many causes that Ida B. Wells dedicated her life to. Lynching is when a mob kills someone, especially by hanging, for an alleged offense with or without trial. Most of the victims of lynch mobs in American history were African Americans, and lynching was a way to terrify the African American community into submission. Often lynching involved torture and other crimes against humanity. Things that I don't even want to mention today. Ida B. Wells started writing articles about lynching in the newspaper, and white-owned newspapers in Memphis became offended and warned in writing that citizens would be justified in attacking her newspaper. They could do that. Shortly after her lynching articles were published, a white mob set fire to the Free Speech newspaper building. Fortunately, Wells was vacationing in Manhattan at the time. She never returned to Memphis. Wells stayed in New York City and worked for a local newspaper. But this event did not stop her. In 1890, she published a pamphlet, Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All of Its Phases. This one brief document propelled her to national stature. In the pamphlet, she proposed that lynching was really due to economic insecurity in Southern white people who feared that blacks would become prosperous and wished to enforce lower status and rights for black people. Around the time that her pamphlet was published, Southern states disenfranchised African Americans through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other means. This pamphlet was read widely outside of the South. Ida B. Wells followed it in 1895 with another pamphlet called The Red Record. Her work continued many of her observations from the previous pamphlet, but it contained 14 pages of statistical analysis related to lynchings between 1892 and 1895. The pamphlet also included graphic narrative accounts. She pointed out that all of her information came from white reporters and white newspapers. Southern Horrors and the Red Record grabbed the attention of Northerners who did not realize what was happening in the South. In 1893 and 1894, Ida B. Wells took speaking tours to Great Britain in the hope that the United States would be exposed internationally for lynching and lawlessness, and to muster support for her anti-lynching campaign. On the second tour, she wrote articles for a Chicago newspaper about her observations. She was the first African-American woman to be a paid correspondent for a mainstream white newspaper. In Britain, Wells attracted the attention of the powerful and attracted thousands to hear her words. She presented shockingly graphic photos of lynchings. On the last night of her second speaking tour of Great Britain, the London Anti-Lynching Committee was founded. Ironically, it was the first organization found opposed to lynching in the United States, and it was established in the United Kingdom. Its founding patrons included the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leader of the Anglican Communion, and 20 members of Parliament. Though it was appreciated, the founders might have also considered how their own government was treating non-British people in their colonies. But that information was probably not even known to some of them. Ida B. Wells' tour was not received well by the American press. The New York Times, for example, called her a slanderous, nasty-minded mulatress. When I read that, I realized that calling strong, intelligent women who advocated for freedom and mercy by the word nasty had a longer precedent beyond our current leadership. And I was shocked. Later, Ida B. Wells would be one of the founders of the NAACP, but was excluded from the founders list by W.B. Du Bois, the famous historian and academic and advocate for the rights of Black people. He felt that she was too radical. He told anyone who asked, though, that she asked him to admit her name. In her autobiography, she tells that she did not ask Du Bois to do that. Ida B. Wells also founded social clubs in Chicago for Black women. She organized a boycott of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago for its lack of representation of the contributions of African Americans in any way. She was given the responsibility to represent the National Equal Rights League, the nation's oldest human rights organization, in a meeting with President Woodrow Wilson to encourage him to end discrimination in hiring for government jobs. That was like talking to a stone. Wilson sympathized with the first Ku Klux Klan and was in favor of discrimination against African Americans. In 1900, the Chicago Tribune ran a series of articles advocating for racial segregation in the public schools. Ida B. Wells led the opposition to racial segregation by bringing in Jane Addams as an ally. The public schools in Chicago were never officially segregated. Now, if you've ever lived in Chicago, as I have, you would know that though policies were never written down, the city still suffers from de facto segregation in so many ways. In 1908, Ida Wells, her husband, and members of a Bible study group founded the Negro Fellowship League, the first African-American settlement house in Chicago. The organization, in rented space, served as a reading room, library, activity center, and shelter for young Black men in the local community at a time when the local YMCA did not allow Black men to become members. The Negro Fellowship League also assisted with job leads and entrepreneurial leader opportunities for new arrivals in Chicago from southern states, notably those of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North. In 1913, Ida B. Wells organized the Alpha Suffrage Club, a Chicago group advocating for Black women to gain the right to vote, to educate Black women about civic engagement, and to elect African American political candidates. The following two paragraphs that I'm going to read are from Wikipedia. A lot of the sermon draws from an article on Ida B. Wells. As Wells and her white friend, Belle Squire, were organizing the Alpha Club, the National Association of Women's Suffrage Association was organizing a suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., marching the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson as president in 1913. Suffragists from across the country gathered to demand universal suffrage. Wells, together with a delegation of members from Chicago, attended. On the day of the march, the head of the Illinois delegation told the Wells delegates that the Suffrage Association wanted to keep the delegation entirely white, and all African American suffragettes, including Wells, were to walk at the end of the parade in a colored delegation. Instead of going to the back with other African Americans, however, Wells waited with the spectators as the parade was underway and stepped into the white Illinois delegation as they passed by. She visibly linked arms with her white suffragette colleagues for the rest of the parade, demonstrating, according to the Chicago Defender, the universality of the women's civil rights movement. Ida B. Wells ran for state senate in Illinois but lost. She still considered herself a journalist and investigated and reported on the East St. Louis race riots and a massacre in Arkansas. She publicly supported black workers becoming organized into unions. And in all that she did locally in Illinois and nationally, Ida B. Wells still found the time to marry Ferdinand Barnett, a lawyer, and rear 4 children in Chicago. She died in 1931, being 68 years old. This morning, I've given you a lot of information about Ida B. Wells. I know that you cannot contain it at all. I cannot contain it all. I gave you this information so that something would stick. There was so much to impart, I felt that nothing could be left out without diminishing her contributions to civil rights in the United States. Ida B. Wells was passionate about justice and human rights. After her close friends was lynched by a mob of white men, she had a zeal for exposing harm to African Americans and for ending lynching. It was not even illegal throughout the United States to lynch, for a lynch mob to kill someone. Do you know when lynching became completely illegal in the United States? The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was signed into law by President Joe Biden on March 29th, 2022, more than a century after Wells' first pamphlet. There were other laws, but they were not as comprehensive as this one was, and almost did not make it through the Senate. Then Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer remarked on the Senate floor after the bill's passage that after more than 200 failed attempts to outlaw lynching, Congress is finally succeeding in taking the long overdue action by passing the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Hallelujah, it's long overdue. It's amazing to think all of our lives, or almost all of our lives, lynching was not a federal crime. That bill began with Ida B. Wells calling the United States, indeed the world, to see what was happening in this country. She was destined to be a social justice activist and a journalist. She wanted people to know the truth about the land of the free. She was determined that everyone should know the horror inflicted upon African Americans. She believed intensely in human rights. She wanted the world to know that permitting lynching and other forms of oppression meant that the United States was not the democracy that it claimed to be. Ida B. Wells had to be herself. She was an intelligent, resourceful, outspoken African-American woman who loved learning and had to be the person she was born to be, even if that meant challenging a nation and risking her personal safety. She is one of the most courageous persons I have read about. I am disappointed that in all my formal UU seminary education in Chicago, her name was never mentioned. Our former purposes and principles of our Unitarian Universalist Association call us to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience, and the use of democratic process in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Ida B. Wells was neither a Unitarian nor a Universalist. She did, however, live those principles in her life as fully as I can imagine anyone doing, by living them so completely. She presents an example for us in our time. For her spirit and her courage, may we be truly, truly grateful. Amen.